Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the That Was Stupid podcast. I am so excited to be in the thick of season 2, and boy, today is going to be a treat. This gentleman that I'm bringing on the show is someone I met a couple years ago through a mutual friend. Went out and met with him. Actually, did some consulting with him on a book that he has written that we are actually going to be talking about today. But that's not why I'm bringing him on, right? I'm not bringing him on to toot my own horn or anything like that, because actually, what he ended up writing was tons better than what I maybe suggested he should write. So this is awesome. His name is Lee Coate. He pastors a church out in Las Vegas, and he's also a consultant for churches and groups for a place called Momentum. Has just a lot of wisdom, but he has a really stupid decision. And so in general, we like to talk about, and have candid conversations about, decisions that ended up being life-changing and life-giving and world-changing. But every once in a while, I like to talk to people who have made a that was stupid decision that was in fact stupid, right? That actually was painful and didn't go well, because I think there's a lot that we can learn in our mistakes, and sometimes we learn more in our mistakes than we do our successes. And so Lee is going to talk about a decision that he made that that ended up being awful, and in a sense kind of changed the trajectory of his life. So I guess in that case, it ended up being life-changing. And so that also then will lead to the book that he has written about people that he calls type I's, right? So this isn't an Enneagram thing, and he'll talk a little bit about that, but this is for people who are, who like to lead loud and large, and also for people who love people like that, which I happen to be someone who leads loud and large. So this is great. But before we get to the conversation with Mr. Lee Coate, I want to let you know that this podcast episode is brought to you by the Veritas Creative. If you do need help coming up with a book idea, if you do need help refining a book idea, if you feel like you have a book locked inside of you that you want to get on Amazon, you can go to theveritascreative.com, and they will help you with that process. That happens also to be the company that I am a part of. And like I said, we went out and helped Lee refine some of the idea for this book. And he actually ended up taking it and making it even better. But I love the little note that he sent me. It says, appreciate your part in making this a reality, and it is not lost on me, and that means the world. So go to theveritascreative.com if you want help refining or creating your book idea. So without further ado, let's talk to Lee Coate, the author of Being Peter, and someone who has a pretty stupid decision that he wants to bring with you today. Lee, thank you so much for joining the That Was Stupid podcast. I'm excited to be back talking with you. I've spent time with you in Las Vegas, where you are pastoring, and it was a great time, although I was with someone who actually got sick on the trip, so that wasn't fun. But it is really good to have you, and I'm really excited to talk about your new book that's just come out called Being Peter. So thank you for joining the podcast.
John, thanks for having me. I remember you coming, and you didn't have the typical Vegas experience because, your partner in crime was down and out for the count. But we had some good times. We had some good meals and some great conversation. And so I'm hopeful that conversation will continue today. I really appreciate what you're doing here, and just glad to be alongside. This should be fun.
And so I think what I'm excited about, we were talking a little bit before, is that, generally, and how we've done this in That Was Stupid is it's a decision that, was, everyone was calling stupid at the time. It ended up being life-changing, whatnot. But I think what I love about your take and what we're going to talk about today is that you made a decision out of, I'll just say in general, maybe fear, maybe some unhealthy things that you're like, no. It was really stupid. I should not have done this. And obviously, as someone who does therapy and talks about mental health, and I love how you're going to frame this. So I'll set it up a little bit, and then I want you to take over. So you, well, maybe let's start here. tell us a little bit about your background, because I think that might lead into the That Was Stupid story a little bit. So tell us a little bit about Lee Coate.
Absolutely. So, pastor in the church faith circles for now over 30 years, and so always very ambitious in that lane. We obviously that choose to do this, we use the word calling a lot, and we believe that we're doing it for some substantial, significant, eternal purposes. And so I've always kind of been that way and motivated by that. And so my life journey has been in that. And there are obviously the challenges of that choice and that calling and that career. You're kind of a mixture of leader, pastor, people person, dealing with hurts and needs and wants of people. And then you're also an organizational leader as well, like in the business aspects of it. So what a lot of people don't recognize, or your listeners, is that when someone's pastoring and they're loving their community, there's also a lot of other elements that are going on there. And so I've been in that for over 30 years. And I spent 8 years kind of in the middle of that journey as what we would call a church entrepreneur, where going into a community with a few people here in Las Vegas and deciding that we were going to launch a new faith community, a new church. And this was during the time that Vegas was exploding in the early 2000s. And so it was an exciting journey there, but also a grind, John, like a grind, right? And so the launching a church was not the stupid part, though. I would caution people that are out there, whether it's a church, a business, anything, right? The launching of anything is just way more engaged and involved than anybody thinks. So I did that and loved it, actually. Like, it just met so many needs, but that I had, but also hopefully met some needs of people in the community. But as you alluded to, over 8 years, the grind of that took its toll for me, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. And where my stupid story kind of starts is on the edge of that. And where after 7 or 8 years of getting this off the ground, seeing some real impact, real life change with people, kind of looking in the mirror and going, I am tired. I am not in a good spot. I am fried, frankly, and trying to figure out what you do with that.
Okay, so here's the question I want to ask, because I think there are a lot of people, we've had business leaders, we've had, whoever, we've had a lot of people, right? And I think there is an underlying current of that I want to make sure that people don't hear, which is, I hate hustle culture, right? And yet there are aspects of that are important, right? So
Correct.
My question to you would be, as you're building these faith communities, as you're having success, what is it that made you realize you were burned out? Because I think there's a lot of people who may be like, maybe I'm burned out. I think I'm burned out. Like, what is it? How did you realize you were burned out?
Well, I think I'll answer that in a couple ways. Number one is, I don't know if I did. So the time frame 20 plus years ago was slightly different in that in a positive way, we've begun to have conversations like we're having right now. 20 years ago, those conversations were much rarer and fewer and far between. And so the optics of burnout, the optics of even words like depression, words like those were not as accepted as they are now. And add a layer to that, John, as you know, in faith circles, it was even less, right? Because the idea was, if you have good faith, if you have thriving faith, those things should not affect you, right? In some ways, that's the enemy. We use code words. It's the enemy. It's demonic. It's right. Something's wrong with you. Now add a third layer of you're in leadership, you're in pastoral leadership, right? So culturally, it's not as acceptable to talk about. In the church, it's not acceptable. And then especially if you're someone who is leading, to be really honest and vulnerable around areas of struggle is not good. And then I'll add a fourth and I'll be done, is my wiring did not really open up possibilities of that. Because of my wiring, which I talk about in the book, there was less openness to being able to admit and be honest about the areas that I was struggling. And so you replace some of that with the word you used. I'm not necessarily an enemy of hustle culture. I think there's a place for it, as you said. But I think there's a time where we get in a funky spot and we replace help with hustle. We replace help with hustle. Like we need help, we need assistance, we need community, but instead we hustle harder, and if we're not addicted to something chemically or in other ways, we can be addicted to the hustle, and it can kind of soothe a little bit of that. And so that's how I dealt with it. I just hustled harder, to try to correct the things that I was dealing with. And we had lots of successes, John, but at the same time, anytime you're doing something like this, there are a lot of low points, and especially when you're dealing with people. Unfortunately, people suck sometimes. And so pastorally, dealing with people, like there was a lot of betrayal. It felt like betrayal. That's a strong word, but people that were in and then they weren't. And there was a lot of, frustration with that. And when you're a driver by nature, you look at the optics of what you're producing. It's not right, but you look at it, and if you're not producing enough or at the rate you think you should, that will lend itself again to kind of looking in the mirror and being frustrated.
Man, there's a phrase that you said during that I think is really good, which was, replacing help with hustle. Oh man, is that good, right? And so I think maybe that kind of brings us now. Let's get to the "that was stupid" moment where you are struggling, and you get an opportunity, an offer, and you're like, this is it. Okay. So take us to that part of the story where you make your "that was stupid" decision. That was, in fact, stupid.
So last night, the night before we're recording this, I went with my wife and my son to see the movie Inside Out 2. And so if any listeners end up seeing it, it's almost like a cameo appearance in the movie with this older gal who plays the emotion of nostalgia. And so she keeps showing up at little parts, and it's kind of a humorous off. And I think part of what happened to me was in the midst of my hustle and my burnout, there was a nostalgia that was comforting around where I had been. So I had spent some early years in ministry in the Pacific Northwest, working with some individuals there. And it was just we were young. We were like, we didn't have a care in the world. We're just, 16, 18 hours a day. We're just changing the world. Everything's fun. We're at Denny's at 2 a.m., all that, right? It's the extension of college. And so there was a nostalgia around that I always held of those great times. Well, in the midst of these difficult times, an individual from that season reached out to me, not really knowing what was going on with me. So in fairness to them, it was just an authentic reach out like, hey, I've got an opportunity here. I think you'd be perfect. And then they said some key things, John. They said things, again, just part of the conversation. They did not know what they were triggering in me. They said things like, here's your salary, right? And as a struggling entrepreneur, financially, personal finance was difficult, right? Check to check, paycheck, check. Here's your salary. And I'm like, well, okay, that got my attention. Here's your personal executive assistant. Okay, that got my attention. Okay, here's your expense account with a credit card. Here's your, right? And here's our team. And here's the people. And it's like all the things that were externally felt like they were contributing to my frustration. This person was answering. And so it really quickly led me to do what was stupid, and to lose some perspective on what was going on, and to what later my therapist, getting to the end of the story, my therapist would say is, that's what we call a parachute moment, where you're given a parachute out of something that's really painful. And so instead of wrestling through that, you just pull the ripcord. And so for me, that's what I did. I just pulled the ripcord. for any of your listeners that are in the church circles, we have this that are not in the church circles. We have this thing in the church circles that's same in the secular world. We should just call it spin, but we call it spiritualizing things. So when we make a move and we don't want to be honest about it, we spiritualize it, right? So we say, my season here is done. I've been called to this other place. God is moving me on. We use all these code words. It basically means I'm done with you and there's a better opportunity and I'm going to take it. And so that's what I did, and pulled the ripcord, and it started a domino that lasted well over a year of just real emotion, going deep emotionally to a really dark place. And also, unfortunately, other people in the way of that, right? You have a church community that thinks they're hiring this really highly effective individual, and instead they're hiring a very broken, burned out, messed up individual, and they inherited that. And in fairness, we're not equipped or ready for what was walking in. And so there was a lot of shrapnel from that move. And then a young family that also was pulled into that. And so really stupid, and took a lot of time to unwrap. And again, back to the nostalgia piece, part of it was, this was great before, it's gonna be great again. And it's just, it's like putting your high school Letterman's jacket on after 25 years. If you're that guy that's like wearing the jacket and going to Friday night football games, like, and talking about when you almost won the championship 25 years ago. I mean, there's part of that that's cool, and there's part of it that's really kind of disturbing. And so I think that's kind of what this move was. It was a reaching and a grasping for something that was, and all it did was really elevate the problem.
And so, okay, man, there's a couple questions I want to ask. I want to come back to that, but then how did you realize? How long did it take you to realize that was stupid? And then what did you do about it?
I was afraid you were going to ask that question because the answer is surprising. Not long. So there was a season. Okay. So just for backstory, I accepted this new role. I exited in my current role. I've been in Las Vegas for over 30 years. Love Las Vegas. Whatever anyone's opinion of Las Vegas is, I don't care. I live here. I'm a resident. The minute I got here, I just love the people, the city of Las Vegas, not what people come and visit, but the part of it that's in me. And so whatever city you're in or whatever, when you feel like, man, this is my place, right? But what was great is for the first 2 months of the relationship, I was flying up and down. So I would fly there and I would be a rock star, and I'd walk into meetings and I'd throw out ideas, and everybody's like, oh my God, this is amazing, right? And then I'd fly home and I'd sleep in my own bed for 3 days and go to my familiar restaurants and do those things, right? So I was great. This was like, I'm living my best life. Well, when it came time to pack up the truck, when it came time to put all our possessions, when it came time to turn off the lights in the house and drive away and put all of that in the rearview mirror, it took about 8 hours of driving in the middle of Oregon to start weeping profusely while driving. And it was a deeper weeping than just, what would be normal for saying goodbye to something, that you feel like, yeah, there's an appropriate, I'm sad and now I'm ready. This was an ingrained, I have made the biggest mistake of my life, and I can't do anything about it because I've got all my possessions and the people I care about sitting next to me, and this is bad. And so the short answer is, it happened real quick, where internally, not verbalizing and not outward to others, even my wife, but internally, there was a switch that went off that said, I was stupid and I don't know how I'm going to recover from this move.
It was your Tiger King moment. I am never going to financially recover from this. I'm never going to emotionally recover from this, right?
And I got to tell you, John, like the wiring I have, I was always that person that was like, I got answers, right? Whether they were the right or the wrong ones, I've got them, right? I've got ideas. We're going to do this. I can solve problems. this was one of the first times, and I remember driving that U-Haul. My son was about 7, sleeping next to me as the sun went down, headed up Interstate 5, and just thinking, I'm screwed, and I don't have any scenario that fixes this. And because I was already in an emotional bad place, right, it was compounded. I think if the decision wasn't made from that spot and it was just purely a wise or a well thought out decision, I would have had sadness at the departure, but not this deep sense of regret that almost instantaneously hit me. That was devastating.
Wow. So how long did you
The
stay
podcast got real dark real quick,
No,
John. Sorry.
Look at me, you know,
People are like, oh my gosh, I got to turn this off.
As we're recording this, you know, I just came out today and told everyone I'm a recovering alcoholic. I mean, it's great.
Yeah.
I mean, here we go.
Here we go.
So how did you, because I think the lesson that I want people to take is, it's not that you're going to make mistakes, right? You're going to make poor decisions. But what do you do with that? And how do you turn that into a positive? Because I think that's like this, that was stupid, candid conversations on taking chances and proving everyone wrong. It's not always going to be in the actual decision, but it's going to be how you recover from that decision. So to maybe put a bow on this aspect of the story before we kind of segue in how this affected you writing this great book, is how did you, in a sense, recover from that? What was the conclusion to, and what can be the lesson for people who realize maybe, hey, I made this decision out of, wrong motives, or there was wrong information, or I did this in an unhealthy way. So how did you recover from that?
And I think that, obviously this is a big life moment, right? But I think for your listeners, as they're doing things, they're out there, right? They're risking, they're putting themselves out there. They've got ideas. I think there has to be an awareness of, in the midst of being that individual, right? We also have to pay attention to where we are mentally, right? Are we doing the things that are going to keep us in a solid place? Are we having those conversations? Are we asking for help? Because again, if you are someone who is operating in a way that others would feel is stupid or foolish, but it's exactly what you're supposed to be doing, it doesn't make you immune to these kind of moments, right? And I would say it actually makes you more likely to have them, right? And so you can be truly stupid in the midst of doing things that other people would judge to be stupid, right? And so I would say that's where you have to guard. Okay. So like for me, it was the church planting, right? That was like, that's stupid. Like, why would anyone do that? Just go work at a church that can guarantee all that, right? I'm like, no, I'm wired that way. The minute I got out of that, right, I in some ways, I sort of betrayed my calling. That's where I really got sucked into the other piece. But it was there because I didn't do the work in the midst of what I was called to do. I didn't pause and do the work. I thought I was bigger, better. I thought I could work through it, right? So what happened there on the other side is, once it kind of came out, and it took a few months for it to sort of really emerge to where I'm like, I'm paralyzed. I don't want to be here. I hate everyone. Then it was a long haul of months of everything from real therapy, right? Where I met with people. I met with one individual that said, you have 8 of the 9 symptoms of clinical depression. The 9th being, and the 9th being you want to kill yourself, which you haven't said, but they said you have the other 8. And I said, you're crazy. I'm a Christian. And they said, no, and then they talked about, how, most of the time we work with people through talk therapy and different things from what we would call 0 to get them back to a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They said, you're at a negative 10. So we may need to do some medication and things like that just to get you to 0, so that then the other things that we can do that are not, chemically related can have the best chance to be effective. And so, did that for a season, not forever, but did it for a season. And so I would just say to your listeners, like, if they're wrestling with any of that stuff, there's a level of like prayer and spiritual disciplines and things like that in the Christian faith world, we believe are obviously helpful, or whatever your faith direction is. But there are other things that are beyond that, right? That really need to be dealt with from people who are wise and smart that we believe God is positioned to be able to help us. So I did that, so I started to open myself up, lots of therapy, both by myself, with my wife, lots of conversations, a lot of unpacking of how I got here, what led me here, the wiring that I have, and some of that even led to what I wrote. And then kind of having, frankly, John, to kind of put my head down and get humiliated a little bit, and to kind of pay the price for the decision. Like, in other words, like we talk a lot about redemption and grace, and those things are amazing, right? But there's also consequences. Like, redemption and grace don't cover up everything that, decisions have. They have factors. And so, it was a walk back of some things, right? That I had to do. But man, even today, as I'm talking to you, and I'm trying to do the math, that season was 17, 18 years ago. I probably need to pray more often. A prayer that I prayed early in that was, God, as I emerge from this, allow there to be some scar tissue that will remain on the surface, that I can be reminded of what led to this moment so that I don't take that journey again. Probably need to pray that a little more often now, because the further you get from it, you can find yourself back in those same patterns and habits that will, if you're not careful, put you right back in that funk all over again. And so, yeah. And so it was probably a year to a 2-year long-term journey to right the ship a little bit. And honestly, John, I think that before we switch to the book thing, I think that it's still a thing, if I can be honest with the listener, like, anxiety, control, some of those things, they still spin in me, there's days, I have bad days where some of the stuff that led me to pull the ripcord, I don't pull the ripcord, thankfully, but those things don't just go away. They sit there, right? And they sit underneath the surface. And so it's an ongoing journey for me.
Man, thank you for being so open about. There's you talked about the medication, right? I think, you and I have talked about this. I talk about it in my own book, how this is both a physical and a spiritual issue, right? And I use the analogy of glasses. Like, you can hand me a book and tell me to read it, but if I don't have my glasses on, like, I'm not going to be able to read it, right? So I put my glasses on, which is the physical, it's the medication, and then I can read the book, And so I appreciate you saying that. I think the other thing is, man, the scar tissue, right? As someone who has finally dealt with demons that I either didn't know were there or that I had suppressed for so long, and used alcohol in the last, in the prior, year and a half to deal with, that prayer for scar. I've never heard it like that, but it's interesting. When I was talking to my publisher about writing this book, one of the questions they had was, are you too close to the moment of struggle, right? And I said, listen, there are a ton of books written by people who are 10, 15, 20 years sober. There's not a lot written by people who are a year and a half into it. And I said, here's what I've learned, or here's what I think. I think that the closer I am to it, the closer that I feel those pains and can still taste the bourbon on my lips, right? Like, I think there's actually a real gift there that I can be able to write about. And they're like, yes. And so for you to even say that, like, you know what? I do need to pray a little bit to be reminded of how I felt and those decisions that I made. I mean, that was just encouraging to me as I'm going on this journey to write about my own struggle. So I really appreciate that. And you, in kind of that, you talked about who you are, right? Your personality and your traits and how you still struggle. And I think that's a great segue to talking about your book, which I was so, when you and I met in Vegas, I don't know, was that 2 years ago now or something like that?
Yeah.
We were kind of talking about this idea, right? And this is, in a sense, the fruition of some of those conversations. And you sent me the first few chapters, and I read it and I said, oh my gosh, because part of, Lee, what I am learning to deal with in my own therapy, especially what I realized I was covering up with alcohol, was rooted in some of the stuff that I was told when I was younger, which was, you are too loud. Man, I'm going to get emotional. You are too loud. You are too much. You are too hyper. You talk too much, like all that stuff, right? And you have written a book all for not just people like me, but also people who love people like me, called Being Peter, Permission to Live and Lead Loud and Large. And it's about this idea of people who are a personality type that you call personality type I. And so would you do the honor of introducing that concept and why you wrote this book? Because I think it is so important.
I appreciate that. I think number one, it's years of living this way, exactly as you described, that brought to the point where I need to write about this and share. Right, the things that we write are years, decades, sometimes in the percolation process before they emerge. And so, over the years, as I thought about what to write, if someone would have asked me 10 years ago, man, you're going to write something, what are you going to write? This would not have been it. And I'm so thrilled that it is it, because I do think it has a unique message. The basis is the idea of being Peter is that for so long, especially in faith circles, right, there's been what I believe an undertone of sort of the more spiritual you are, the more you stare at your belly button and you go away and you're quiet all the time and you meditate and you lay your head on Jesus' shoulder like the Apostle John did in scriptures. And that's who we all want to be. And I get that. There are elements of all that as far as spiritual disciplines that are important. I'm not being sarcastic or about the need for those things. What I am saying is I think there has been also a limitation on people who are wired differently in how they express that. And so my purpose in writing this book was to give people like yourself, John, permission, who are wired differently. As I say in the book, I'm not really trying to deal with, Enneagram 8s or, extrovert, introvert. This is not a personality book. I think I would even describe it more as a wiring, because I think there are different Enneagrams, probably different disc, layouts or strength finders or working genius, whatever you use, that probably there are different ones that actually still have this wiring, what I call a type I, right? So I use I words to kind of set it up. It's the idea of like, man, you're super intense, right? You are an instigator, right? You tend to be kind of, in a way, the person in the room that's really typically an innovator. Like you have ideas. You can be a little bit impulsive as well. And even some other words like irritating, right? Those all sort of encompass the type I. And in scripture, Peter is my hero because he encompasses so many of those things. But yet we see him emerge on the other side, still living out his type I, but actually understanding and living out in a healthier contribution to the world in his type I isms, right? And so over the season of learning and him being with Christ and him learning how and making mistakes and screwing up and him pulling the ripcord around the fire and saying, I don't know who he is, right? And having to come back in some ways and get his heart right, all led him to a spot where he had the ability. He needed his type I not to be suppressed, but to be given permission and to be given appropriate guardrails in order for it to be healthy. And so just try to take the reader on a journey through that. Now, some of you aren't type I's. This book is still helpful for you. Number one, there's leadership principles and life principles that are, irregardless of your wiring, are still appropriate. But also, so many of us are married to, we work with, we work for, we're on teams with people who are like this, and they're so frustrating to us. And our tendency is going to be to suppress and to hinder them. If we do that, we're missing out on the amazing contributions that those individuals can bring to our lives and to the places that we live and breathe.
And I think there's another I word, and it's a little bit what you were talking about, because that I really latched onto, and it's the idea of just in general finding your identity, right? And I think as I talk about my own journey, my book will talk about kind of the four steps that I took to come out of an addiction. And one of those is finding your true identity, right? So I think when you start talking about identity, and that's a lot about what this book in a sense is, there is nothing bad that happens when you really start to understand who you are, the good parts, but also the bad parts, right? And so my question is for type I people, how do we, I think one of my struggles, I just had this happen, right? Sometimes getting feedback is really hard for me, right? Because it feels personal. So how do we type I people and those that are listening, how do we balance the good of who we are, but also understand, hey, there's also some negatives, right? Like, and how do we deal with those as well?
Yeah, there are definitely some shadow sides of the type I wiring. One of the things that happens to a lot of us as type Is that we need to deal with is, I think, in a healthy way, type Is typically care deeply. Like, we care deeply about, oftentimes, people. We care deeply about projects. We care deeply about whatever the latest thing is we're pursuing. We tend to care deeply about those things. And so part of where the identity comes out is, number one, being okay with the identity, identifying and understanding who we are. And so part of how we deal with it is coming to grips with it. It's a little cliche, I realize, but part of the book is to kind of give you permission to go, that's who I am. Right? That, yes, I'm probably going to talk too much. I'm probably going to be the loudest person. I'm probably going to walk into a room and be overwhelming for people. And so part of it is going, that's who I am, and not trying to be someone I'm not. And then the journey from that is to go, okay, how do we put some healthy boundaries, guardrails, and borders around that to make it, to make the tendency more healthy than unhealthy. In one of the chapters, I talk about the private place versus the public space. And that's going to be really important for a type I, because a type I will typically function, whether they're introvert or extrovert, they will typically lean into that public space, right? And we're obsessed with the public space in the culture we live in, right? The optics, how do we look, right? Some of it's needed, it's necessary. Like, you kind of have to be in that in the day and age we live in. Right? At the same time, if we are living solely in that public space as a type I, we're going to deal with comparisons and competition and all those things that public space. So we even see in Jesus' life, right, that withdrawal to the public or to the private place. And I think Peter, as he watched Jesus, learned that, right? And as type Is, as we learn to do the work in the private place, the work in the private place is going to allow us to thrive in the public space. And so part of our journey in being Peter is to learn about that and to identify ourselves through that. And then we talk about topics like the right amount of the tension between humility and ambition. What do we do with that, right? Cowardice, because type Is have a lot of fears that sit under the surface. And so the moment that some of those things get called into question, we can pull back. And so to your point, right? Like, sometimes we're afraid of feedback. Like, we get feedback and all of a sudden we cower. It's like, what happened to me? It's like, well, someone actually pushed back on me. It's like, you can't do that, right? So I'm just going to walk away. And so I think we learn how, part of the conversation is to do that. Here's the thing that's awesome is that I actually didn't know how I was going to land this conversation in the book. So you're writing and you're kind of walking through the framework, and there, some of the people that were helping me kept saying, what's the last chapter? How's it going to conclude? And I was like, I have no idea. Leave me alone. And so I'm proud of how it actually landed. And so the way that it landed, without any too many spoilers for those that'll read it, is, I really said, how does Peter's story kind of end, or at least what are the last few things? And one of the things I landed on was, Peter comes out of this cowardice moment where he denies Christ and he's humiliated and he goes back, right? He goes back, right? It's his moment of pulling the ripcord. And then Jesus invites him back into relationship. Hey, get back get back on the horse, get back on the leadership. And within a short period of time, we are in the narrative of the early church movement, right? Can't even really call it a church. It's those early followers of Christ. And in the first chapter of the book of Acts, there's chaos around the leadership. And it says these words, John, it says, and then Peter stood up. And I read that and I thought, that's interesting. Like he stood up in a confident way, but not in an obnoxious, irritating way. So I'm like, that's interesting. Chapter 2, there's a moment there for the readers who are unaware where there's this movement within the city and all the city comes to see what's going on and it's chaos. And it says the same thing. It says, and then Peter stood up and he began to speak and he began to communicate, clarify. And I thought, wow. What a journey from the shores of the Sea of Galilee as a frustrated fisherman to where in the midst of this moment, this movement needed leadership, he stood up, right? And he didn't lose his type I, but now we see where that transformative formation took him. And so that's kind of how the story really lands. You read more about that journey, but I'm proud of how it lands because I think that's a ideal way that a type I, if we can have more of those standing up moments that are healthy, I think it's ideal.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. The last question I want to ask you is kind of a fun one. Well, the second to last is when I got the book in the mail, there was a penny.
Yes.
So you don't have to fully give it away, or maybe you want to, but why did I get a penny? If you're watching this, if you're a premium
you're welcome,
subscriber.
by the way, John, don't spend it all in one place.
I know. Thank you. I'm going on vacation starting tomorrow. So this will be very helpful.
The story about this. Yeah. The story behind the penny, is, and I unpack it in the identity chapter, where I really talk about this idea of like, who are we? And is that, I was adopted, as a 2-day-old infant. And so the first 25, 26 years of my life, well, that was my family. That was my father. Later on, as I became an adult, I was introduced to my birth parents, and have a relationship with them. But the book is really about my parents who gave me their identity. They adopted me. They chose me and brought me in, and I was part of their family, and I never questioned that. That was completely who I was. And so the conversation there is around how being confident in your identity and not really kind of being, wavering around it is so important. And the reason behind the penny is that when my father passed away, and he was never a wealthy man, hard worker, but never wealthy. He had lived the last decade of his life, on Social Security, and I had cared for him and had managed as best I could the small amount of finances that he had to make sure that he lived. But when he passed away, when I went to settle and kind of close all of those accounts, there was a series of accounting things that had to happen. But at the end of the day, I'm literally standing at the teller. No one goes to bank tellers anymore. But I literally went to the teller and I was closing the account. And when she was all said and done, she literally pushed 3 pennies across the counter and said, here's, the account is closed. Here's what you get. And I walked out of that bank and I thought, that is insane. But I didn't feel ripped off because the story is I have 2 sisters. And so I thought, here's this individual that gave me his identity. And at the end of the day, what I inherited to most people would seem like each child got 1 penny. That was what financially we got, but we got so much more, right? That at the end of the day, it was fine that I only got the penny because I recognized what my life would have been without that father and that mentor and that caring person. So the penny is just a reminder of the greater identity that you have, and that we all have that opportunity to lean into the way that we were fearfully and wonderfully made. So that's the story. You can read more. I think it's chapter 3 in the book.
And in a sense, maybe emptied himself out, right? Like had given everything, right? And so all that was left, he wasn't saving it, right? No. All right, my last question. This is the question that I ask everyone. When you think back to your "that was stupid" story, we covered that a little bit, but what is your advice for people listening now, and whether that's, whether that kind of goes into the book as well, but when you think about that was stupid story, what's that paramount advice that you have for people listening?
I think that for those of you that are listening right now that are potentially you're spinning a little bit, that underneath the surface, there are things going on. There are questions you are asking. There are frustrations. There are maybe even candid conversations that you're not having with those who are partnering or working alongside you, that are clarifying, that are freeing. I think I would encourage you, not knowing your context, obviously, but I think I would encourage you to stop suppressing and pushing that down and not confronting it, right? And I'm not suggesting you walk into whatever context tomorrow or start firing off emails or text messages, but I do think the biggest "I was stupid" message is I just didn't. I think if I would have done some healthier things in being honest or dealing with, hey, this is frustrating. What can we change about that? What about this situation, right? How can we lower the tension that exists? I think there would have been an opportunity for me to get to a healthier place, right? I even think about silly things, or what seems like silly things, like sabbaticals and appropriate pauses that people need to take. I think if someone wise would have been standing there, or if I would have, maybe I needed to invite someone wise into that, they might have said, before you pull that ripcord, let's step back a little bit and let's pause and let's process this decision. Let's process where we are. And maybe we're still going to make that move. Maybe we're not. But I think one of the things that I've learned recently is there's a difference between an Eastern and a Western mindset when we approach challenges and problems. And a Western mindset tends to take on something. Here's the issue. If you're watching, right? We just tend to look at it. We say, here's how we solve that. And we hit it head on. And there's something about that that's that's great. An Eastern mindset, we've learned, actually does much more of a circling process that keeps getting closer and closer to the deal. And so I think as you're looking at processing things in your life, I would encourage you to make sure you're circling enough and not just plowing in. I think maybe that's a type I trait too, John, right? Is we tend to just take a look and go, I got it. And so I think as you're listening, I just encourage you, whatever you're processing, whatever ripcord you're wanting to pull, whatever big decision, be risky, be bold, be courageous, do it, have convictions. I love all of that. But just make sure that you've put the appropriate processing in place so that when you do that, you can step confidently into it. Whether you win or lose with the decision, you feel good about the process that you've done.
And I can say this. I mean, this comes at a good time. I pulled the ripcord on something this past Friday, and I did not follow the processes that I've put in place. And one of those processes is when I get passionate about something and I write and send an email, I let my wife read it first, and I didn't. Right. And to your point, which I think is really good, I'm facing the consequences. Like I've repaired for the most part what resulted, yet there are still consequences. Right. And so that doesn't, it doesn't mean that, well, I'm a type I, so I can excuse it. Right.
Correct.
It explains it, doesn't excuse some of that crud. So I think I love that parting advice, because I should have circled that decision, right? Instead of just saying, you know what, I'm upset, or I'm offended, or this isn't right, or whatever.
Yeah, because John, timing is also a part of every decision, right? It's an underrated element of leadership and of life. Like whatever you did in that circumstance may have been ultimately the right trajectory or the right thing. It's just your approach, the timing, all those things, sometimes we don't take into account. So the circling or the processing isn't necessarily a yes or no on the decision. Oftentimes it's just really getting full perspective on how to move forward in that decision in a way that's actually going to provide the healthiest outcome on the other side. And so as type Is, a little bit more circling is probably typically appropriate.
Oh, I love that, Lee. Okay, so if people want to learn more about you, about Being Peter, if they want to grab Being Peter, because you also do, I mean, if you're a church leader that's listening to this podcast, Lee actually works with a group called Growmentum that does consulting with churches and nonprofits and leadership. So where can people go to learn more about you in the book?
Yeah. So two things. One is, my website, which is just my name, leecoate.com, has information there. You can connect with me and those sorts of things. Love to continue the conversation, have a chance to sit with your team even. We have teams that are now reading Being Peter together. There's some key takeaways and questions at the end of each chapter. So it's set up for teams that want to have that conversation. So I'd love to Zoom, come in, speak, be a part of those conversations, be open to that. But then the book is available exclusively on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle or e-reader form. And so the audio book is TBD or is coming, right? John, you know that process. So
yep.
if you're someone who listens, stand by, that's coming. But right now you can grab it on paperback and ebook. And just John, thank you for having me, bro. I appreciate the conversation. It's fun to unpack stuff with you. Love the way you think and love that you're doing this to help others.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you for coming on. I really cannot, I ended up doing an endorsement at the front of this book. I've been asked to do that a lot, and I've been very selective in doing that. And so I wholeheartedly believe that this book is really helpful. Again, not just for the type I's, but also the people that love people like us. Lee, thanks so much for joining. If you ever find yourself in Vegas, anyone, there's a great church. You can go off the strip and go to Lee's church. We'll talk soon, Lee. Well, I don't know about you, but that was absolutely awesome. You heard me cry a little bit, right? Because I think, especially when it comes to people who lead loud and large, we have been told for a long time to quiet down, to stifle, to put a lid on, to not be X, to not be Y, to not be Z. And I think for a long time, I lived with that. I lived just trying to stifle who I was, not giving myself an excuse to be a jerk. And I have been a jerk, and I continue at times to be a jerk. And the Lord is refining my hard edges. But finding your identity, like I'm going to talk about in my upcoming book, like I said, is so huge. And I think this book has helped reinforce what I thought was some of my identity, but also understand it on a deeper level. And I just love what Lee talked about in knowing, hey, listen, I knew within hours that this was a bad decision. I remember myself while I moved to New York City. After my wife and I got married, I took a job there. And within 2 days of taking that job, I was walking down right outside of Grand Central Station, Vanderbilt Avenue. And I said, what have I done? I have made the wrong decision. Now, what's interesting is God needed to bring me to New York because that's how I got a job in the news business. So if I wouldn't have been in New York, I wouldn't have been in the news business. And I don't think I'd be doing what I was doing today, right? But it wasn't the job, it was the location. And so I spent a lot of time unpacking that with God. Why am I here? Did I make the wrong decision? And so I think sometimes we inherently know. So I want you to push into that, though. Push into those check marks, those checkpoints, I should say, along the way, those people that are in your life to help you decide if something is a good idea or a stupid idea. Listen, I love you. If you love this show as much as I love you, would you please like, rate, share it? We have so many more great guests coming up in season 2, and we will see you again next time on That Was Stupid.